Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks everybody for still being here. Giving the impression of still being awake even. No worries. And thanks very much for the invitation once again. It's the fourth time that I've been able to come to Budapest in this context, and it actually feels familiar. So I really love the way you framed the family picture, right? Feels familiar, but at the same time, it's always exciting new encounters, topics, colleagues. So I'm really glad to be here. Maybe before I start, the topic, as you said, is about fundamental rights in a multi-level system. I would like to emphasize, I chose deliberately the term multi-level system to avoid federalism, and I found out today that I'm really glad that I did, because I think much of our discussions in this context here, and specifically today, seems to feature a certain conceptual rigidity. We talk about constitutions as if it were a scale, something is a constitution or not. German colleague of mine coined like a list of 9 criteria, and no constitution will fulfill all of them, and certainly Europe fulfills many of them. Same applies to sovereignty. We had this debate earlier today, and I think federalism is a particularly problematic term, which all of these are scales, and maybe it helps to avoid these terms that are loaded with very kind of rigid conceptual connotations. And as an alternative to federalism, I'd offer supranationalism, which I think doesn't come with the internal kind of implicit target or directionality towards a state-like integration. This being said, fundamental rights protection in a multi-level system. Now, if possible, I should try to, it does work, great. So here we are. Glad. I mean, these are little successes in the afternoon, but there's a major problem to, chose this topic, I thought it's interesting, so many people debate the issue of multi-level systems and fundamental rights protection. And actually, my conclusion is we should not overrate it. I'm quite aware of the fact that that's a bad way to sell your presentation, to say, well, let's not overrate the issue. But then again, could sell well if at least for one we have a problem that we should not be too concerned about. And I'll try to argue why I think it's overrated and why I think we should focus on matters. It's more or less solved, let's put it that way. So, the way I'm trying to make this claim is first, I'd like to address the problems that fundamental rights protection, FRP, sorry for the abbreviation, addresses. I mean, very generally the question, why do we have it? And that's in general, and why do we have it in the EU? Second, the problems that fundamental rights protection may generate, in general and specifically with regard to the multi-level system of the EU. And thirdly, what are the problems that have remained unresolved in this regard? And specifically with regard to the first 2 questions. Does it serve the function, and has it managed to somehow deal with the problems? And finally, obviously, I'll try to revisit the claim. Now, very, very simply, first one, the problems that fundamental rights protection addresses. Obviously, we all know that. Generally, the idea of having a fundamental rights catalog can list them in different categories, but more or less it's about providing symbolic integration, providing some normative orientation. That's what our fundamental rights catalogs, we heard about this earlier, them being part in so many constitutions, do, and most importantly, printed in bold letters here, to provide for enforceable, subjectively enforceable over time, right? Limits on public power. Now, within the EU, obviously the function more or less is the same, but there are some specific aspects I'd like to underscore, and that is we do need that in the EU just because well, of the development of the EU. If you look at the question historically, the EU could do well without fundamental rights protection for a long time. Stauder case has been mentioned, 1969, the first time they discovered, well, we might need to have some checks on this supranational, emerging supranational power. But, I mean, as you know, it took 50 years for the Charter of Fundamental Rights to be put in place. So one could ask the question, why is it that we didn't need it for so long a time? And the answer is quite obvious. There was some large degree of fundamental rights protection already at the member state level. There was some debate about to what extent it could be extended, expanded to the supranational level. But mostly, of course, this was because the EU may have a very, and increasingly over time, active legislature, but it doesn't have a strong executive branch. And that's typically where fundamental rights protection kicks in, right? So it only, with increasing growth of the supranational level, the need for such protection grew. And as you all know, the European Court of Justice managed to, for a long time, contain or meet this need by its creative jurisprudence on fundamental rights protection. So basically, it's not, in a way, self-suggesting, for at least in the history of the EU, that it even has fundamental rights protection. It's certainly, at the stage that it has reached now, should have fundamental rights protection. And the idea was to complement the kind of protection that has already been in place on member state level. And here we see a major, I mean, it's reflected in a clear structural difference between the supranational fundamental rights protection that we have on EU level as opposed to all the other international fundamental rights instruments that we have. They give a second protective level to the signatory or member states' fundamental rights regimes. The EU does not. The EU complements fundamental rights protection as against the new area of public power that has moved to the supranational level. So a different situation from the outset. Next step. The problems that fundamental rights protection may generate. Very generally, not specifically with regards to multi-level systems, one thing is fundamental rights are wonderful in that they protect liberty and equality and maybe even kind of some expectation of solidarity within a society against the state. But the idea is, of course, to protect it against government, the legislature, and hence it needs to be stabilized. Such stabilization can be excessive. It can turn out over the time that fundamental rights catalogs that are typically highly entrenched, high up in the normative hierarchy, might grow into something that is outdated, felt as being sclerotic, etc. So I'm not suggesting that this is the case everywhere or that it's a problem that should make us reconsider whether we should have fundamental rights protection, but excessive stabilization, I think, is one of the issues that at least developed long-term, long-standing fundamental rights problems, fundamental rights regimes run into. Second, fundamental rights protection has an impact on the interplay of divided powers. It's courts that interpret them, and to the extent that they assume the authority to even override the legislature, it can be and should be a counter-majoritarian institution. And at the same time, of course, counter-majoritarian might mean undemocratic. So the shift in the interplay of divided powers is an inherent problem of fundamental rights protection. I'm not suggesting, again, that we should, for this reason, not have fundamental rights protection, but we should be aware of that. This is one of the inherent challenges there. Now, thus far, the general risks in fundamental rights protection. The second one, second issue, so in a multi-level system, and specifically in the EU, what are the challenges that fundamental rights protection generates here? First one, well, same as above. That's just an inherent feature of all fundamental rights protection systems. Beyond that, in a multi-level system, one key topic, and if you look at the literature, now I use the F word, of comparative federalism, one of the issues is excessive homogenization. It might be an issue if you introduce on the upper level within a multi-level system some fundamental rights protection scheme, that it overrides or encroaches too strongly upon the oftentimes pre-existing decentralized system. So that's one of the challenges. As with the challenges above, I'm not suggesting that these are kind of the arguments that should trump all the other concerns, but it's one of the challenges. One more, very important one, maybe not as obvious as the others, that is that fundamental rights protection schemes on a centralized level tend to come into conflict with the system of divided competences within these systems. That has been historically the case in the US, it has been the case in a couple of other federal systems, or at least an issue, a couple of other federal systems. And here's why that is the case. I said it might not be that obvious. If you perceive of fundamental rights in the very traditional kind of historical function, they are just meant to shield off encroachments by government against the individual, right? So it's a bipolar vertical relationship. The individual can kind of fend off certain kinds of encroachment by public power. In this case, and with regard to this dimension, there is no obvious interference that fundamental rights protection could bring about with regard to the division of competences. But most fundamental rights protection schemes nowadays recognize more than this negative defensive function. They perceive of fundamental rights, I mentioned this issue of normative orientation more generally, as a function of fundamental rights systems. Most systems acknowledge that fundamental rights guarantees also provide a positive dimension, a duty to protect, maybe even a duty to provide. Think of major, shall we say, health policy, nuclear policy as the protection duties, or welfare, education as potentially positive rights that they might enshrine. Now, if that is being acknowledged, and as I said, most systems do, and specifically the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU, explicitly in Article 51, Section 1, second sentence, mentions this positive dimension. If you acknowledge that, then of course obliging a polity to provide actively, not just to abstain from interference, this can easily be understood as a mandate to regulate, to legislate, to make policies. And this is where the competence problem comes in. This is why fundamental rights are at times in multi-level systems understood as a new mandate, or interpreted or maybe abused as a new mandate for the central level to just act upon their duties under the fundamental rights catalogs in order to make policies in areas in which they might not be competent or might not have been competent before. And I'll say a few more words on that in a second. Now, last specific challenge is contradictions. If you create a multi-level system with coexisting fundamental rights protection schemes, they might contradict, they might come into conflict. And that's the other big challenge that is out there. Now, last analytical step. What are the problems, now, as we have very briefly revisited, the problems that fundamental rights should solve, the problems that fundamental rights generate? What's the situation with regard to the EU? Now, I would argue, well, the thing is entitled The Problems That Have Remained Unresolved, and I should qualify the term unresolved. all of the problems that I've mentioned aren't problems that can be solved. It's just, as I said, I mean, it's always about managing certain challenges, striking a balance between counterweighting interests. So the question, is something unresolved, is rather, is there something that has not been reasonably taken care of in the EU with regard to this. Now, the general problems, I think the symbolic and normative integration or orientation that fundamental rights can offer is a function that is being served well within the EU by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. I don't really see any major need to address that. Providing a check on public power, and specifically this additional new supranational check on public power, my perception of the discussion is that this is not something that is being viewed as deficient in the debate currently. There are, and again the Germans, cases in which one would have wished, or some member states or some kind of debates in member states would have wished for the European Court to be somewhat more rigid, but more or less this function of providing a check on public power, on the European public power, seems to work quite okay. At least it's not neglected or not properly addressed. Again, we can disagree on the way, on individual decisions in certain cases, but by and large, I think this works. I think the issues of overstabilization, not an issue so far, but probably we should watch out for that. I mean, it's a young system of fundamental rights protection in the EU, not even 20 years, so rigidity and overstabilization typically grows over time. The catalog initially is really vague and obscure. It becomes more and more specific and potentially rigid as jurisprudence develops. In this case, I don't think we're there yet. So not a problem either. The horizontal balance of powers, and I emphasize horizontal balance of powers, i.e. is the court growing too strong as compared to the other branches of power on supranational level, doesn't seem to be a major issue either. So I think largely the fundamental rights system serves the general purposes quite well that are being assigned to these systems, and it avoids, or at least addresses in a reasonable fashion, the main challenges. Maybe one exception, the individual remedies available on the European level are rather limited. This is to be explained by the specific supranational nature, but there is, at least if you compare it to a national scheme of protection, individual remedies, constitutional complaint-like procedures are relatively underdeveloped on the European level so far, but we might discuss whether that's because it's underdeveloped or whether it's just because there is not so much, haven't been so many occasions for that so far. Now, the specific problems, now that's the key. Looking at the specific problems that fundamental rights protection generates in a multi-level system. Again, I would say we do not have the problem of excessive homogenization, as many federal systems will have that. The EU multi-level system does not replace member state fundamental rights catalogs, mostly. Most other multi-level systems are much stronger in that regard. We'll address some aspects of that in a second. Beyond that, interference with the system of competences, this is something that the Charter has, and the primary law of the EU has been almost excessively concerned about. There are 3 mentionings in primary EU law that clarify that the existing system of competences shall not be changed by the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So, a concern that has been addressed and responded to in a rather clear fashion. Now, my claim is that the main remaining issue is contradictions. And the contradictions, the potential contradictions between the coexisting systems, member states and EU level, are generated. Those of you who have dealt with the field before will be very familiar with that. It's about Article 51, first sentence, the question, what does implementation of EU law mean? And the European Court of Justice has had like a really unclear approach to that, but a relatively generous one. Right, the main decision, Ackerberg-Franzen, is still in place, and that's a relatively wide interpretation, which leads to a system in which member states will concurrently apply their own fundamental rights protection schemes in an area in which the EU fundamental rights protection scheme also applies. On the one side, we have purely European institutions acting, just Charter of Fundamental Rights. On the other side, we have the domain of the member states uninterfered with by European law, beyond the competences of the central level, purely member state systems. The main question is in between. So when member states apply, implement EU law, or when they regulate in the area in which the EU has already acted upon their competences. And this is where a lot of debate is going on. Now, first thing is, why is it problematic? Couldn't we just live with such overlap? And there's rhetoric in the primary law that would suggest that it's entirely unproblematic. And that's something that we find very often if we talk about the concurrence of international and national fundamental rights systems. The paradigm being, well, who should complain? Individual rights protection is wonderful, and if we have two systems, we just add them one to another, and the better for the individual, right? And again, the answer is true if we were to think of it just in this bilateral vertical conception of traditional negative fundamental rights protection schemes. If you just perceive of fundamental rights as the individual shielding of encroachments by the state, no problem arises. But that's most typically not the case. We do acknowledge that there are positive duties, and we do acknowledge that in most cases, when we delineate the individual sphere of protection for one individual, we'll typically have to resolve conflict with some other individuals' fundamental rights spheres. The leading cases in Germany, the right to be forgotten cases, are very indicative of that. It's people whose name has been associated, correctly so, with very negative news on the internet, and years after, they want to somehow eradicate that, just not to have this stain on their name for all the time, right? And this is a clearly multipolar, as they say, fundamental rights problem. On the one hand, it's freedom of expression, freedom of information, and on the other hand, it's the privacy, personality issue. So it doesn't make sense here to just perceive of it as adding additional layers of fundamental rights protection. Helping one side means restricting the other. And that's the only remaining sphere in which these contradictions actually lead to potential clashes. And here I'm back to the beginning of my talk. I'm not suggesting that it's unimportant. But these are cases, not all fundamental rights situations, but only the multipolar ones. These are cases that are typically hard cases. Cases in which, if you analyze them and if you analyze the decisions upon them, in which typically the courts are split, in which you could go either way. These cases attract a lot of attention. They attract a lot of judicial energy in maintaining their say. I mean, specifically the German court, again, as always, has been really eager to maintain its say within the sphere of overlap. And I think they come with an extremely divisive potential, because what's happening there potentially is a clash of these kind of ultimate arbiters in the respective systems. So they're not unimportant, but we will probably all agree that we can agree to disagree on these cases. And I think it's just not worthwhile risking for these high-end fundamental rights problems in which we only want to determine which of the courts, and we don't even know which one we would typically side, is going to have the final say, that attract most of the divisive potential and discussion. So to sum up, fundamental rights protection, of course, is extremely important, and it's an intricate issue, especially in fundamental rights and in multi-level systems. I think in the EU, its main functions are being served, its main problems are being kept in check, and the remaining problems are potentially more divisive than is warranted by their relevance. Not to overrate them does not mean, of course, to ignore them, but to manage them accordingly. So find a clear-cut solution and pick your battles, fight about other things. Thanks very much.